So the layout was quite complex, with hidden doors, with shelves that actually masked doors, and the main door was an airlocked door that had a little panel, and so it could only be opened from the outside with a code that only Fritzl knew. The entire structure was soundproofed and was also reinforced with concrete, much like an atomic bomb shelter. 6 years later, and his building was finally complete. And it was on Wednesday, the 28th of August, 1984, when he put his vile plan into motion. So I know I've been a little bit MIA, but I've been working on a brand new series which I think you're going to love. So I will be dropping a trailer for that series later this week, so keep an eye out on my channel for that. So let's get into today's episode. So I've read many books on true crime, I've watched many documentaries, series, and even movie adaptations of true crime stories, but the case I am going to be talking about in this episode was one that has stuck with me and still haunts me to this day. Looking at the face of this man for me is like looking into the face of pure evil. But before I get into that, let me introduce myself. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with makeup, true crime, and uncovering the motives that drive people to do what they do. So every week I post a brand new video that looks at a true life crime from a psychological viewpoint, as well as delving a little bit deeper into what drove people to do what they did. And I also happen to do a makeup look while discussing these cases, and I share psychological knowledge and concepts that you may or may not be aware of. So if that sounds like something that you may be interested in, then be sure to stick around. So just a quick disclaimer for today's story. Today's story contains material citing incest, infant mortality, and sexual assault. As always, I will issue further warnings as the story unfolds. I mean absolutely no disrespect to the victims involved. The purpose of this video is to shed light on the heinous true crime that was committed, whilst spreading awareness about the narrative. This story has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes real-life accounts and footage from individuals who were involved directly in the case. Underground and through 8 locked doors, a young girl was held captive for 24 years. During this time, she was beaten, raped, gave birth, and raised 6 children. But the most horrific part? The man who captured her was the same man who raised her father. And shortly after being arrested, Josef Fritzl would utter 5 words that would shock the world. I was born to rape. Growing up, Elisabeth was described as a happy child. She was described as a cute little girl who was quiet in nature. One of her childhood friends, Krista Waldrich, remembers how she was quite reserved at home, which was different to how she was outside. As she grew older, her behavior began to change and her grades started dropping. So whilst her peers began talking about boys and crushes and, you know, the usual stuff that preteens talk about, she never partook in these conversations. She also later stated that the abuse she suffered from her father began when she was 11 years old, where he would start to leave pornographic magazines underneath her pillow, and he would also masturbate in front of her. According to her childhood friends and family, Elisabeth was scared of her father. He would also take her everywhere with him when she wasn't confined to the home. And although she was one of 7 children, he only ever did this with her. He would not encourage her to have friends, and he did not permit her to have a boyfriend. On top of this, he would engage in horrendous behavior like reading her diary, going through her personal belongings, and physically stopping her friends from entering the Fritzl house. So 2 years prior to her disappearance, she had actually run away from home. Unfortunately, the police had found her and Fritzl had brought her home. And unbeknownst to her, he already had a plan in action, and he said to her,
"You will never run away again."
So the first time she ran away, there were absolutely no investigations or even questions raised about why she ran away in the first place. Only after her disappearance was a case opened and was the Fritzl family investigated. So a few days after her disappearance, a letter had arrived. It had said something along the lines of, "I've decided to live my life. I'm in a cult. Don't look for me. Don't worry. I'm fine." And because she had previously run away before, the police did not think too much of it. And so 1 year after her disappearance, the case was closed and Elisabeth Fritzl was seemingly forgotten by media and police. That is until the events of the 19th of April 2008. Wait, stop. You need to know what happened. So let's rewind the story about 30 years to be precise. So the year was 1978 and Elisabeth was around 11 years old. If you will remember me mentioning earlier, this was around the point in time where her father started to abuse her. So this year was significant because it was the year that Fritzl started planning the kidnapping of his daughter. It began by obtaining a building permit for a bomb shelter, something that was not super uncommon as it was just after the war. During the next few years, he did everything pretty much by himself, from the electrical installations and electronics to the machine construction. So I'll explain more about Josef Fritzl in a little bit, but what you need to know for now is that he was an engineer by trade. He was actually known as a technical genius. So after he had built the initial room, he then went on to build a second room and a top-notch security system. So the layout was quite complex, with hidden doors, with shelves that actually masked doors, and the main door was an airlocked door that had a little panel, and so it could only be opened from the outside with a code that only Fritzl knew. The entire structure was soundproofed and was also reinforced with concrete, much like an atomic bomb shelter. 6 years later and his building was finally complete. And it was on Wednesday the 28th of August 1984 when he put his vile plan into motion. His wife was out that particular day and he had lured Elisabeth into the basement. Whilst her back was turned, he had chloroformed her and dragged her into the air-locked room. She had woken up hours later, handcuffed and alone. And this would be the beginning of a 24-year-long ordeal for her. The very next day, she was reported missing by Josef Fritzl himself. To everyone, Elisabeth Fritzl had disappeared without a trace. Her family and friends searched for her, but to no avail. And unbeknownst to them, just a few meters underground, Elisabeth Fritzl was being held. For the first 5 years of captivity, Elisabeth was completely alone, except for once a day when Josef would come, usually around nightfall in the dead of night, and he would rape her without saying a word. It's estimated that he would have raped her around 3,000 times, a figure that was drawn from the testimony that Elisabeth later gave. I can't imagine the degree of loneliness, of pain, and of fear she experienced in those first 5 years, not having anyone to talk to, no one to comfort her, nowhere to look for support, and then having her father, the man who raised her, rape her every single day. And then things went from bad to worse. When Elisabeth was 23 years old, she discovered that she was pregnant. Elisabeth pleaded with Josef for medical intervention for this pregnancy, but he refused, and instead he brought her a medical book on childbirth and pregnancy, as well as some equipment, utensils to help her deliver her baby herself. And with that, she was left to give birth alone in a basement to a child that had been fathered by her father. Elisabeth persevered, and she made it through that pregnancy and birth. And on the 30th of August 1988, she gave birth to a baby girl, Kirsten, the girl who would ultimately play a major role in bringing this entire sordid narrative to light. In 1990, she gave birth again, this time to a baby boy, Stefan, and then came Lisa in 1992. So it was during this time that Josef realized that he had a problem. He was running out of space in this basement. He began to bring children upstairs, and no one even batted an eyelid. He first brought up Lisa, who was 9 months old at the time, and he left her at the front door with a note. His wife opens the front door to find this baby with a note in Elisabeth's handwriting stating that she could no longer look after the child. And so she brought the child into the home and began raising it. When asked in later years how he chose who got to go upstairs and who stayed downstairs, he said he chose the noisiest ones, the crybabies, to go upstairs because in his mind he was worried that somehow, in some way, the neighbors would hear them. 2 years later, in 1994, Monica is born, and a few months later, and she is left outside the Fritzl's door. Elisabeth's mom, Rosa Marie, then later received a phone call from Elisabeth asking her to take care of the child. It's unclear, and I couldn't pinpoint it in research, whether it was Fritzl pretending to be Elisabeth or if it was a recording. But you know what? Through all these years, Elisabeth was an amazing mother. She loved these children. She looked after them, she protected them, she taught them to read and write, and she educated them as best as she could. Their only link to the outside world was a small little box television that they had, and Josef. As the years went by, Elisabeth continued to be raped by Josef, and he continued to rule the basement like a tyrant, pretty much how he had on the surface. He would often threaten the children and Elisabeth if they angered him. If anyone tried to stand up to him, he would tell them that he would leave, he would close the door, and he would see how long they would survive without him. And he would tell them that he had poisonous gas installed in the ceilings and he could at any time activate it to kill them. In 1996, Elisabeth is pregnant once again, but this time with twins. One of the twins, Michael, suffers from respiratory failure at birth, and without medical intervention that Elisabeth begs Josef to give him, the baby passes away. Elisabeth had to sit and watch her baby die, completely helpless. In an entry from her diary that was unearthed, she recorded how she cradled him in her arms as he suffered from breathing complications. "At least he's in a better world now," she wrote. Josef then went on to incinerate his tiny body, in his mind finding a solution to a problem with no further thought on it. The other twin, Alexander, was then taken upstairs when he was around 15 months old. And as if everything that Josef was doing was not bad enough, he would then take great joy in telling the children who were remaining in the basement about the lives that the children who were living free upstairs were living. He would even take photos of these children in the pool having a barbecue, and he would bring those photos downstairs to show the children who were trapped in the basement with no escape. And that for me is just a whole nother level of disgusting. So whilst the 3 children were upstairs enjoying summer as children do, summer for the family in the basement meant that the temperatures would be rising and the basement would literally become like an oven, with condensation pouring down the walls. Elisabeth had wrote in her diary, "We are always happier when summer's over." He would even go on holiday and leave them in the basement for extended periods of time. It's said that he even went to Thailand in what was deemed a sleazy sex vacation, and he had just left them rations of food in the basement. And this torture and way of life continued until the 19th of April 2008. Although Josef had planned for absolutely almost everything, he couldn't plan for when Kirsten fell ill, and Elisabeth managed to convince him to take her to hospital. What they both didn't know at the time was that Kirsten was actually suffering from kidney and lung failure. So the doctors at the hospital were alarmed by 2 main things. One, the fact that she was incredibly sickly looking and very pale, because of course, remember, she had never seen the sun. And the second one is that they couldn't find her on any records on their database, because of course, her birth was not registered. So in situations like that, immediately questions are raised and the police were called. They had then turned their attention to the man that had brought her in, who had claimed to be her grandfather. His behavior was described as disturbing, with him being aggressive, arrogant, and not wanting to answer questions. After speaking to the police, it was discovered that this was none other than Josef Fritzl. People remembered him because of the Elisabeth Fritzl disappearance, which was a really big deal in the small town of Amstetten in Austria. So at this point, his story got even more bizarre, as if it was not bizarre enough already. He told them that Kirsten had been left at his doorstep by Elisabeth, who had left a note saying that Kirsten was ill and that Fritzl should look after her. So the doctors then decided to launch a public media appeal for Elisabeth. Because remember, at this point, they still believed that she was in a cult, and they still believed Fritzl's stories. So a media announcement went out on the news and in newspapers looking for Elisabeth. And during this time, Kirsten was put into a medically induced coma because they wanted to get a medical history on her. And then 5 days later, Elisabeth Fritzl stepped into the hospital after being MIA for 24 years. Under tight surveillance from Josef, Elisabeth, who was now 42 years old, had aged prematurely. Her skin was so pale it was almost transparent, and she looked incredibly sickly. It was at this point in time that the hospital decided to call the police, and Elisabeth and Josef were then taken to the police station, where the horrors of the last 24 years were about to be unearthed. After 5 hours, Elisabeth Fritzl finally spoke, after she was also guaranteed that she would no longer have to see or go back to Josef Fritzl. And it wasn't long after that that the news of her ordeal broke to the media, and before long the small Austrian town of Amstetten was overrun with reporters and journalists. Upon having heard Elisabeth's testimony, the police had rushed to the home, and they had received the code to enter the basement from Josef Fritzl, and they had released the 2 remaining children, Stefan and Felix. Felix was only 5 years old at the time. It's reported that in the police car on the way from getting the children, Felix had his hands pressed up against the window and he was gazing out as the police car drove because he had never seen in real life grass or the sky or flowers or birds. He was absolutely transfixed by this magical world that he had never seen in real life. In case you didn't guess this part, Josef Fritzl was arrested. So I'm often asked, what causes people to commit such atrocious acts? I think it's quite an interesting question because it highlights the fact that as humans, we have this need to understand that there is something fundamentally that separates us from them being the people that commit these crimes. Because if there aren't any telltale signs or indicators, then someone who is part of them could be your neighbor, your friend, your family member, and you wouldn't even know it. And I think ultimately that's what terrifies people. So for me, looking at the childhood of a perpetrator allows me to better understand their future actions. As I analyze Josef Fritzl's childhood development, I will try to remain as unbiased as possible. Please understand though that this analysis is in no way a diagnosis, and I'm not trying to disregard or deflect blame for his heinous actions. I merely want to gather and share a deeper understanding. Okay, so first of all, I just want to start off by saying I pronounce his name Josef because that is how I have heard the Austrian documentaries and news station pieces pronounce his name, so I figured that was the most correct way, as he is Austrian, and so I've stuck with that pronunciation, but other people call him Joseph. I thought it was Joseph as well before I started researching this case in depth. So Josef Fritzl was born on April 9th, 1935 to Maria and Josef Senior Fritzl. As an infant, his father left the family and his mother went on to raise him alone. His father then went on to fight in World War II and he actually died in 1944 in the war. And this left Josef with his mother. So she did not treat him very well. She would leave him to cry for hours, even if he was in pain. She would beat him and she would just generally ignore him. Due to this strained relationship, he developed an ambivalent attachment pattern to his mother, and it was this attachment pattern that would later go on to affect his future relationships. During later sessions with psychiatrist Adelaide Kussner about his mother, Fritzl would say, "She never showed me any love. She beat me and kicked me until I was on the floor and bleeding," he said. "I felt so weak and humiliated. I never got a kiss from her or even a hug. Even though I tried very hard to please her, the only thing she did with me was go to church. She beat me and kicked me until I was lying on the floor bleeding. I had a horrible fear from her. She kept insulting me and told me I was a Satan, a criminal, a no good." Maria was impulsive and aggressive, and this, coupled with the poverty-stricken post-war environment that Josef grew up with, further added to the trauma of his childhood experiences, and all of these played a vital role in affecting the development of his personality. A major incident that he recalled within his childhood that really stood out for him and stayed with him for years to come was when he had a urinary tract infection and his mother had simply just left it because she couldn't get the money together to sort it out, and he really remembers feeling not only helpless and hopeless, but he remembers feeling an intense hatred. So a really interesting understanding within developmental psychology is that if a child is not shown any empathy towards him or her when they're young, they find it really difficult as they grow up to feel for others later on in life. For example, if something is not experienced within their childhood, they find it incredibly difficult to understand that and to then replicate it for their own children later on in life. And this is evident in the way that Josef Fritzl raised his children, with frequent corporal punishment and insistence on being called sir and no form of secure attachment whatsoever. This is the childhood that he had known, and so this is the childhood that he gave them towards his mother. The psychiatrist who assessed him doesn't feel as though his childhood is entirely to blame though. And she also explained that his meticulous attention to detail signaled that he was not mentally ill. Josef Fritzl and his wife Rosemarie were married in 1955 in the rural village of Amstetten in Austria. They had 7 children in total, 5 girls and 2 boys. During this time though, his unhealthy relationship with women was still constantly developing. It was later discovered that Josef used to play peeping Tom, and he used to watch couples getting intimate from outside the window. He would then also follow women to the park and masturbate. So as you can see, his behavior was escalating. It started off by watching, and then it led to following, until one day he followed a woman home and then raped her. He was caught and then sentenced to 18 months in prison. And it was at this point in time that he had been married to Rosemarie for 12 years. Instead of leaving him though, she had covered for him, and she told everyone that he was overseas on a contract that had something to do with his current occupation. So I would have handled that slightly differently, but you need to keep in mind she was quite used to bearing the brunt of his anger. Her sister even remarked on how when she was pregnant, Josef had broken her foot. Yeah, so clearly he's been a good guy for a very long time. It also emerged that in 1959, his mother had moved in with Rosemarie and himself when they had gotten married. He later admitted that he had locked her up in the attic until her death in 1980. Furthermore, he had bricked up the attic window, and he had told the neighbors that she had died. So earlier I mentioned that Josef pretty much built the bunker himself, and he was able to do this because he was an electromechanic by trade. He had also made the bulk of his wealth through real estate. Within the small village of Amstetten, he was well respected and well liked by everyone. He was known as being a good-natured person. Well, I guess looks are deceiving. So out and around in the village, he was known as being a good-natured man, but that was a completely different story within his home. In his home, he was described as being incredibly authoritarian. His wife, Rosemarie, had absolutely no say in anything in the home or the raising of the children. And towards his children, Josef was no different. He was incredibly violent, but he saved the brunt of his anger and his violence for Elisabeth, who was the 4th child. And so it was, as I previously mentioned, when Elisabeth was 11 years old, he had devised and put his plan into place to ultimately kidnap and hold her hostage. Dr. Adelaide then went on to state that Fritzl saw Elisabeth as his wife, not daughter. He believed he was giving her and the children a normal family life. Fritzl's trial began on the 16th of March 2009. He was charged with rape, incest, kidnapping, slavery, and murder, and faced the maximum sentence, life imprisonment. During his court hearing, which lasted all of 2 days, he admitted everything that had happened over the last 24 years. During the trial, only 100 journalists were picked to attend. It is rumored, and 1 or 2 sites did confirm, that Elisabeth herself actually came to the trial, but to protect her and her identity, her testimony was only video recorded and played for the jury. Her testimony was 11 hours worth of her describing in excruciating detail everything that had happened over the past 24 years. Josef's argument was that he had been protecting her, that he saw that she had headed down a bad path, and so he was just helping her to stop making bad life choices. And he felt that that level of intervening within her life was only right of a parent. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that raping your daughter and fathering 6 children with her is not exactly what every parent does. He also mentioned to the psychiatrist who evaluated him that he was incredibly disciplined in everything he did. Once he closed the door to the basement, in his mind he also closed a door per se. So it was a case of out of sight, out of mind. And that's how he kept his upstairs world completely different to his downstairs world. It can be said, therefore, that he has an innate ability to block out the parts of reality that do not fit his narrative, repressing his darkest actions to the back of his mind. During the 24 years, he had meticulously planned everything out. He had traveled miles and miles away to do grocery shopping and throw away the rubbish that came from the basement so that he would not be recognized and so that he wouldn't arouse suspicion. Quite a shocking turn of events. When Josef heard Elisabeth's testimony, he all of a sudden accepted full responsibility for what he had done. On the 4th day of the trial, Josef was sentenced to life imprisonment, and he did not appeal the sentence. But the question on everyone's mind was, how did he get away with it for 24 years? I must admit that I, for one, am still skeptical of Rosemary and the fact that she was supposedly unaware of the happenings in the basement for 24 years. So it is said that Fritzl imposed incredibly strict rules on everyone to kind of stay away from the basement and the area surrounding the basement, and it is known that Rosemary was terrified of Fritzl and he did treat her extremely badly. One can think of the condition of battered woman syndrome to try and explain her behavior. For me, her role in this narrative reminds me of Kay, who was the mother in the Springs House of Horrors episode I covered a little while back. I will just link it up above on screen if you want to go and check that out. But there were so many similarities between that case, which was South African, and this case, which was Austrian. Rosemary's sister is adamant that Rosemary had no knowledge of the tortures that were occurring in the basement just under her home. And she maintains that her sister was a submissive, threatened, abused woman, a victim in this monster's narrative. Even more shockingly, Fritzl used to actually rent out rooms within the home itself, and over the 24 years, there were over 100 different lodges, and not one of them knew anything was amiss. They were also subjected to the same rules. They were told to stay out of the basement and also to keep away from the garden area, which was actually directly above the basement. Josef also changed jobs to allow himself to have a more flexible schedule. He then got more into real estate as well as running his own business, so he had an excuse to always be in the basement drawing up plans or working. What is evident though is that he was incredibly committed, and that commitment did not falter for 24 years. And on an administrative front, the Fritzls legally adopted the 3 children who lived upstairs, and they got regular visits from social services. But not once did anyone ever question where they had come from or their origins. These kids literally popped out of nowhere, landed up on their doorstep with a note from their mother, and no one batted an eyelid. Okay, So I'm sure you're curious, I know I was, to know where everyone is now and how the heck they're doing. Josef Fritzl is serving his life sentence in a special unit for the criminally insane in Kremsstein prison. It is also reported that whilst behind bars, Josef Fritzl has made friends with one of Austria's most notorious serial killers, Harold Sasek, who is known in Austria as the Gas Man. Fritzl has also become friends with triple murderer Gunther Lawrence. And in case you were curious, Fritzl has a new job. What might his job be? Well, he's responsible for washing and folding laundry, wiping down tables, and sweeping floors. He keeps pictures of 3 of the children in his cell, and he's currently trying to achieve his goals of studying law. As per Austrian law, he will be due to be released in 2024, like out in the world again. He will be 89 years old. I mean, still, okay, I know he's pretty old, but, like, why does he get to go free after all of that? Yeah, so after his arrest, he received hundreds of marriage proposals, and to this day, he still has tons of women who want to be involved sexually with him. What? He filed for a divorce from his wife, Rosemarie, in 2012, because she had not been to visit him in prison. Rosemarie, on the other hand, has been given a new identity, and she is said to be living in a small apartment in Linz, Austria. She supports herself by selling her crafts and her paintings, as she no longer receives Josef's pension due to them being divorced. So she is allowed to see her grandchildren and Elisabeth, but this is only after months of therapy, as initially Elisabeth herself had doubts that her mom was ignorant during this 24-year period. On June 28th of 2013, the basement of the Fritzl house was filled with concrete. This was done to prevent the perverts from worshipping it as a shrine, according to Austrian reports. And now, most importantly, probably the people you're most interested in, and that is Elisabeth and all of her children. After their initial release from the basement, Elisabeth and her children were given new identities, and they spent around a year in a clinic. For the children, it was really important for them to adapt to a new world. For the children who were living in the basement, they didn't know the world at all. And for the children who were living in the house, they needed to adapt to this new idea of life. And for Elisabeth, it was returning to a world that she had left 24 years prior. She also received clinical therapy for the next few years to help her deal with her post-traumatic stress disorder. It later came to light that normal everyday occurrences such as closing a door or dimming a light brought on anxiety and panic attacks for Stefan and Kristen, 2 of the children who were living in the basement. This could be explained obviously by the fact that they were never allowed to leave, hence their fear of closed doors, and every time the lights would be dimmed, it would mean that Elisabeth was being raped by Josef. One of the most complex integrations at first and still continuously was the introduction of the upstairs children with the basement children. Both groups have a vast array of their own difficulties to deal with. For the upstairs children, their seemingly normal lives were turned upside down. They were called incest and they had to end up leaving their school. This was difficult for them as they had established a pattern. They had friends, they had after-school activities. For them, life was seemingly normal. They also struggled to call Elisabeth mom, because obviously they had grown up without her, and they were actually calling Rosemarie, their grandmother, they were calling her mom. And that was something that also brought about a lot of contention between Rosemarie and Elisabeth in the beginning. Altogether though, the world that the children who lived upstairs had known was forever changed, and they knew that things would never ever be the same. For the basement children, besides emotional difficulties, they faced many health problems. Years of cheap, beyond sell-by date food had resulted in weak bones and vitamin deficiency. Although polite and friendly to one another, the siblings from upstairs and downstairs are more like strangers than family. All of the children might also have genetic problems due to their incestuous origins as well. For Elisabeth, there might actually be some light at the end of the tunnel. It's reported that in 2009, she found love with her bodyguard, Thomas Wagner, who is actually 23 years her junior. She also went on to learn how to drive, and she said that she is adamant, although her father has taken away the best years of her life, she is going to live every single moment she has to the most. Today, Elisabeth and all 6 of her children live in a secret village in Austria, only known as Village X. They have always, and they continue to refuse any media exposure. Their home is under constant surveillance, and the villagers, who are well aware of who they are, do their part in keeping people away. Elisabeth has always maintained her and her children's privacy, and she even turned down £5 million to tell her story. If you are interested in watching more documentaries, videos, and movies that were based on this particular case, I will leave some recommendations at the end of this video. And so we've reached the Bella bottom line. He believed strongly that the more children he had with Elisabeth, the more control he had over her. And that was his ultimate goal, to possess her. It's the idea of the greater the subjects, the greater the master's power. This is one of the cases that has actually stuck with me and haunted me months and months after initially hearing and reading about it. No amount of justification or jail time can ever make up for the horrors that Elisabeth and her children had to endure. Throughout those 24 years, Elisabeth never lost her sense of humanity, love, and her sense of hope. And she continued to look after her children with everything she had, loving them and protecting them. Which just goes to show you at the end of the day that it only takes a single beam of light to destroy the darkness. And for those of you who want to watch more about the Fritzl case, then check these out.